So what I'd like to tell you about is a little bit about research which we've been doing over the last actually more than 10, 15 years. The bigger goal is to go towards autonomous robots, autonomous humanoids, and we are approaching this, as you will see in a second, very much from a little bit from a machine learning and also neuroscience point of view. You will see some parallels with different disciplines that go into this topic. Very important. Lots of people contributing to this work. I will not mention them all here, but they are really doing the work. Where to get started? So it's a couple of years ago by now. The National Academy of Engineering in the United States basically tried to come up with what are the challenges for the next century, kind of inspired by the year 2000, obviously. And one of the important topics among 14 topics which they generated was to understand the human brain. A very long and standing and very old topic, still not solved. Reverse engineering the brain, understanding how the brain directs perception, motor control, cognition is a fascinating topic. And obviously, if you understand the brain, you can go and try to repair the brain. One important topic, very interesting, is to facilitate learning. Personalized learning is a very hot topic in the United States. How can we actually help every individual to be better, learn faster, learn more, become better at a certain discipline? At my university, there are some particular attempts in this direction. There is Professor Dr. Jerry Loeb, who works actually on BIONS, as he calls them. They're little injectable devices like that. You can put them into muscles, and then you can actually reactivate with radio frequency muscles, which is actually similar to making a human or robot at some point, and obviously it's meant to help impaired people at some point to regain some kind of motor functionality. Very fascinating topic, and it goes into this bigger topic of brain-machine interfaces these days, neural prosthetics, and lots of related topics. The National Academy of Engineering also mentioned that it would be very exciting to create autonomous humanoids, and basically to build a system which is like we are. And I think over the last 15 years, you've seen a lot of explosion in this field. So I think in the mid-90s, there was relatively little going on. Towards the end of the 90s, there was a big influx of new ideas towards humanoid robotics. And I've been having this slide now for almost 15 years. It's been updated, don't worry. The interesting part is that originally when I had this slide, it was pretty much only Japanese robots on that, since it was really the dominant part of the world doing humanoid robotics. And now we see many more. So these are Japanese robots. So this is the HP4, which is a very new robot in Japan. The Honda Asimo is quite known. But then here the Kaufman Institute of Technology is now creating the naked humanoid. The DLR has one. This is one of the very few American humanoids. They're actually a little bit behind over there in terms of kind of systems. Obviously, the ITOP from Italy is quite popular. This is the Nubo robot from Korea. Humanoid robots spread all over the world. So everybody is now getting into this and starting to be interested in this topic. Everybody agrees that at some point we will have assistive robots. We want to send them into hazardous environments, the old topic, out into space, which becomes more interesting for harvesting energy at some point. So lots of interesting research applications happening. And I think now, even in the US, where we're a little bit behind in terms of building these machines, I think that in terms of software and intelligence, we do a relatively good job. The government has now, under Obama, issued a directive that robotics is going to be one of the core topics in the next 10 to 20 years. They're pouring an increasing amount of money into this topic. Now, I come from Los Angeles. If you live in Los Angeles, you have to relate to Hollywood. It's very important. So here's the Hollywood version of humanoid robots, which is kind of nice. So this is if you've seen that, if you're not, you must see if you have this institute somehow a visit, the movie iRobot, which actually starts really nice. So robots walking the dogs, hugging the children. Not sure how much you like that, but why not? Taking care of the trash is definitely an okay thing to do. And it's a great story. It starts out robots everywhere doing useful things, helping people, while one robot runs after a woman who forgot her whatever pills that she needs to take in order to avoid a heart attack. Really great. And then, as usually in Hollywood, it goes totally mad. Robots become wild and kill people. Total disaster. But trailer.
Introducing the NS5, the world's first fully automated domestic assistant. What will you do with yours? Get ready for the I generation.
So this is cool. Since this is not so far away, I really like this commercial. It will happen sooner or later. I'm not sure whether it will be as spectacular, and I'm not sure whether it will be an I generation, since mostly this will be taken by Apple products. It's a really, this is going to happen. I don't know when, 20, 50, something years in the future, we will buy robots like this online. And they will be not violent, they will not go wild, they will be most likely pretty primitive, but they will do useful things around us. And this is really what I'm very excited about, and this is, I think, also what this institute is going to be pushing forward in the next years. One remark, I think it is very important. Robotics is not robotics anymore as it used to be. Robotics used to be very simple motor control, building robots, mechanical engineering, and this has broadened up tremendously. So we tried to structure this some years ago. We came up with something that there is components of research which are action, interaction, and engagement. And the important thing is that we go from basic control of robots to increasingly more complicated perceptual and cognitive functionalities like imitation learning. At some point, if you have a robot which is totally boring, you will not pay any attention to the robot. So you need to also understand how to make this robot engage people it works with, and how to understand how humans react to robots, and how to interpret emotion, how to express some form of emotion, since unfortunately all of us kind of react to these things really well. And the interesting part of that is, of course, at some point, you may fall in love with your robot. And that's on the topic of ethics and social sciences. It's kind of silly, I know that, but it happens. People attach to almost everything. People love their dogs, people love their little gadgets which they have at home, they get attached to their computer game, people also get attached to their robots. And they will fall in love with them. And they may get kind of depressed if the robot fails and dies. And it's crazy, I know that, but it's gonna happen. And people will have to worry about what that means at some point. It's very far-fetched yet, but it's gonna happen. Okay, I'm living in a much more sober world, unfortunately. So I'm really interested in creating autonomous robots more from a bottom-up approach. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we've been doing, and I will show you primarily videos and occasionally a little bit, some equations maybe, which I find particularly exciting. Is this microphone actually working, or if I turn my head, is it always flaring out? Is that working? Yes? Yes. Okay, good. So the way we look at this topic is actually from 3 points. We are interested in theory and algorithms. We're interested in robotic studies, obviously. But we're also interested in neuroscience. And we try to combine these things and then create basically some understanding of how to create humanoid robots. So one of my dreams is really, I've now worked with I don't know how many robots. I'm sick and tired getting these things programmed, and everyone tediously sits down, figures out how the thing works, creating drivers, whatever. I want these things to get them unpacked, put them in the corner, come back after 1 week, and it should work by itself. So I'm very interested in machine learning and this kind of self-organizing autonomy. And this is a little bit down the road, but this is how it should work at some point. There's of course also this new fascinating topic. If you learn how to create these models for robots, robots have one huge advantage of all of you. When you grow up, or when you're a baby, you learn 20 years long before you're anything. Robots will learn in 5 minutes download everything what every robot has learned before. And that will be very, very exciting to get to this point. There will be an exponential explosion of skills at some point in robotics. How we get there, how we create kind of modules which are kind of homogeneous and which work with every robot, that's a little bit down the road. But people work on that. There's many different branches, I think, of science which try to create now reusable software modules for robotics. All right, so the way we started with things is, this is actually longer ago. We wanted to find some generic representations, and I will motivate that in a second, how to basically represent movement and motor control. And then we go on and try to go more on a kind of human level. We would like to teach robots. We don't want to basically manually program everything. Since that's how we as kids grow up. Our parents show us something, we try to mimic it, and then we learn how to really use those skills. And then at some point you have to do trial and error learning. You have to learn how to interact with the environment. And let me see. Nothing happens anymore. Oh, there it is. And you have to, of course, learn how to control and be accurate at some point. So let me go through these points and show you some ideas behind those things. Oh, my computer has a critical slowdown. Maybe it lost its power. Okay, that will help. Okay. So, due to the advance of modern laptop computers, I can now play 9 movies simultaneously. And these are kind of snapshots of things which we've done in the past. A little bit too much light. If someone could dim this light, it might actually be useful. I'm not sure it's so cool. So this is cool. This is like happening, just some tidbit projects happening over the last 10 years roughly. Over there. And they're all doing kind of useful or less useful things. I'm not sure if you can see. This robot is doing 3-ball juggling. There's a robot doing drumming, which is obviously highly important for daily life. These are all toy problems to study motor control. When you choose research, you need to choose something which you can roughly understand and then try to basically make some progress with it. They're not meant to be something which you use in daily life, but which help us to understand motor control and how to do accurate, precise motion, how to teach systems. But there was something which was extremely disconcerting, and this is what's been plaguing robotics for the last 20 to 30 years. The paradigm in most robotics projects is smart human sits down, programs robot, such robot does something. But it's all based on the smart human. And then comes another project and people start all over. Smart human sits down, makes the robot do something. There's no carryover that much from one project to the other. Because the tools, the representation, the way learning is represented always changes from project to project, from robot to robot, from software to software, to operating system to operating system. And it's kind of annoying. And so one of the first things we tried to do at some point was to create a general representation for motor control, motor skills in kind of human-like robots. So how do you do these things? I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with block diagrams and how much you like them, but they're not very complicated. People in control love them. This is the robot, the movement system. It gets a motor command, it creates an output state. There is some intelligent control policy which tries to, for a particular task, try to generate the right motor command at the right time. That's what you do when you play tennis. You just have to know which motor command to generate at every moment of time so that you hit your forehand, for instance. And the interesting question is, how do you learn those control policies? And there's many ways we know from optimal control reinforcement learning, lots of branches of science, a little bit how to do that. But we also know it's really hard to do it in a general way. And then people try to do this in a more structured way, since that might be too unstructured, so they basically parcel that into different components which are more easily understandable and easier to learn. And you can go even one step further. You now try to modularize things, just instead of learning everything in one big box, which is kind of silly. You try to learn different modules, which you reuse hopefully at some point, and this way you kind of accelerate learning. And this is something people call modules, basis behaviors, we call it motor primitives. But it's a very powerful approach to kind of narrow down motor skills into little blocks, which you then can combine to create more complicated behaviors. The hope is that if you do these kind of more nice macro blocks, you can actually learn faster. So, just as a quick view, so what we did at some point, we basically went, this is kind of the generic equation for control policy, we just put this into nonlinear differential equations. Why? Because they have actually some nice properties where you can reason about attractors. And you can think of every behavior to be an attractor. So if I walk, this is a periodic attractor. If I reach for something, that's a point attractor. This is a nice formulation where you can use tools from nonlinear systems theory to analyze things and to have some level of control of what you're doing. I'm not going to go into large details, it's too boring in this short time. But what you can create out of that is essentially a general design principle of motor skills. It means you use some of those differential equations, then you add some machine learning components to that, and you kind of mix this together in the right way, and you can create almost arbitrary motor behaviors out of this. And this is really what we were interested in. The nice thing is that this recipe is always the same. From any skill to another skill, I never change that. The only thing which I'm changing is this function approximator. It's a typical tool in machine learning which we're using all the time, where we have pretty good understanding how to do this these days. Just one fun component. This entire theory inspired us a couple of years ago to actually look into the human brain, whether there's anything which has to do with what we're doing. And one important component of this theory was to predict that actually periodic behavior and discrete behavior, which is kind of limit cycle attractors and point attractors, are inherently different entities in dynamic systems theory. And we looked at this and said, well, so is this also true for neuroscience and for brain science? The reason why we looked into this is essentially that the neuroscience literature is full of people who think that rhythmic behavior is essentially the same as discrete behavior, where you just jump back and forth between 2 points, and the other opinion also existed. And what we did was, so this is an MRI scanner, there's a human here, and people are just wiggling their hands, and they basically create discrete motion with their wrist, or they do periodic motion like that. And it was nicely set up so that it's controlled for all kinds of side effects. And the surprising result was actually that there was a very clear distinction between these kind of different movement regimes, periodic behavior and discrete behavior. This is the human brain. This is the primary motor cortex, which is usually always involved in every motor behavior. If you kind of kill that in your brain, you won't move at all anymore. So this is on the rhythmic behaviors, of course also on the discrete behavior. The interesting part was that discrete behavior had all those other areas turned on, when rhythmic behavior was absolutely silent, only had motor cortex on some little bit of other areas. Which was very surprising actually for the neuroscience community. And if you want to, what are these results useful for just as a scientific insight, one thing, but they're also very useful when you start to create brain-machine interfaces, how to basically read out whether something is periodic behavior, whether something is point-to-point behavior. It's also interesting for movement rehabilitation. So we have a very big rehabilitation group in our university, and they were fascinated by that, since if you have a stroke, for instance, and your left area is gone, then maybe trying to train on discrete motion is a bad idea, but you could still train on rhythmic movement and really basically gain some functionality first based on your functional brain components before you go into discrete movement. So there's interesting implications which can be derived from that. So, so this was a little bit about representations. That was actually very important for us. So this is kind of a core piece, it's a little bit more dry, but now we can do fun stuff. So we can go to teaching and imitation. Imitation learning is, from human culture, is an obvious topic. In robotics, it has been around for at least 30 years. I think Professor Dillman's group actually worked on that since the early 90s at least. And many people have, in the last 10, 15 years, jumped on this topic as well. So imitation learning, the way people look at this actually from a neuroscientific point of view is that you get visual input, the visual input is parsed into spatial information, into object information, and then basically based on this you activate an appropriate movement primitive, and you send this to your motor system and it will be executed, and obviously there's learning components which activate and learn these things. And this is a very general paradigm, and with this representation I just showed you before, it turns out you can actually do imitation learning extremely simple. It becomes a very simple supervised machine learning problem, which is linear and parameter. It essentially lends itself to linear regression techniques, which are trivial to compute in microseconds these days. And then you can do fun things. So this is some older work together with Auke Eisberg, who's a professor at the EPFL now, where we just taught a humanoid robot with an exoskeleton how to do a tennis backhand, very primitive tennis backhand, obviously, not Boris Becker, Wimbledon, or anything like that. But it works, and you can basically put this nicely into one motor primitive, which can create a very complicated movement. This is totally simple to do. It takes a second. Some more recent work, this was done by a fine product of Karlsruhe, actually, Peter Pastor, who, with the help of Tommy Nasfor and Professor Dillman, actually spent some time for his master's thesis in California, and then was so kind to join my lab, and I will never give him away anymore. And here he's showing basically an exoskeleton robot some motor primitives, which basically were the basis of what the robot had to work with. And then you can have a robot which can actually use those primitives for actually motor skills. It's actually very pretty. So this is a hydraulic robot which is very smooth in its control, but it's also the entire motion looks just very human-like, not surprisingly, so it was copied from a human. But it's also something which you can see, it generalizes, it doesn't matter where the cup is. The robot can pour water in the cup no matter where it is. This is part of this representation, and I didn't tell you too much about this. Some of the properties which are inherited. Okay, now I can do teaching and imitation a little bit, and I can do one step more, I can move to trial and error. So why that? While I was on the train, I figured I needed an appropriate picture for that weather. And there's certain things which you cannot learn from imitation, like how to avoid slipping and how to recover from slipping, or there are many other things. So just looking at something gives you some ballpark performance, but then you have to figure out how to do it yourself. So in the literature, this is essentially mostly addressed under reinforcement learning as a general topic. Just reinforcement learning, I've been working on reinforcement learning for about 15 years, and I found it very frustrating most of the time. So it was an incredibly slow set of algorithms, very hard to get them to performance at all, lots of parameter twiddling. And it's just recently that there's actually a new wave which I find very exciting and where it can start to work. And let me just give you a quick overview of that. Reinforcement learning, for those of you who don't know that, it's actually very simple. Every time you do something, you get a reward. You call it R, and over a certain movement, for example, with model skill, you just try to sum up all these rewards and you try to maximize them. That's it. So it's a long-term reward problem. It's also related to optimization periodically. Let me just use this in the context of motor primitives. And then there's lots of algorithms, like gradient algorithms, there's probabilistic algorithms, there's some strange intermediate algorithms. And recently we stumbled more or less about a new approach, which is reinforcement learning with path integrals. Let me show you, this actually works. All the other ones kind of work, but this really works. It's kind of advertising. Now, if I had any time, I would now try to explain you this slide. It is absolutely beautiful. I'm not sure whether you agree with that. Okay. This is just optimal control theory. You can find the first few things in textbooks. What is really interesting is only those two things. There's basically a trick which people discovered how to transform optimal control theories into log transformations which make the equation simpler. And then there is the surprising idea that the physicist Richard Feynman worked on exactly such equations many years ago in the context of particle physics and came up with solutions to a special set of differential equations which you can use in this context. And then suddenly you end up with some manageable math. And from this kind of crazy stuff, in case you like algorithms, you can come up with, this is a typical machine learning representation. We show algorithms by 5 steps or 6 steps where you go through and then you have an algorithm. This is actually very simple, which comes out of this formalism. So let me show you what you can do with that. So here's okay, my contrast is lousy. Can you see anything? Yeah, oh, just making it really dark. Okay, well, we'll try. So this is actually, this is a simulated little robot dog. I'll raise my mouse pointer. You might still see something. Let me see. Does this work? Yeah. So this is a simulated robot dog which jumps over a gap, which you see here. Initially, it's doing this in a really bad way. And then you do these algorithms for about 10, 20 trials, and it learns to jump literally twice as fast. Reinforcement learning, so this is very hard to see. I'll show you something else in a second. Reinforcement learning is learned within about 10 to 100 trials. It's incredibly fast. In the old days, we were talking about 500,000 to 1 million trials or even more. So there has been, with help of lots of other people obviously, and it's incredible advance of algorithms, what they can do. I mean, now they're so when humans learn something, if you learn a new task, you don't want to talk tennis or golf or something. 100, 200, 500 trials is very reasonable for learning time. That happens all the time. So we're pretty much now in the realm of human performance. An ex-student of mine, Jan Peters, and his student Jens Kober at the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen actually used an algorithm which is essentially similar in its math a few years ago to learn the robot arm, the game of Kandama. This is the ball in a cup game. And they start with saying they use our motor primitive representation as a starter, but then it doesn't work, of course. If you just mimic a task which is highly dynamic and stochastic like this, it never works. And they ran the learning algorithm for a while, and after about, I think, 100 trials, they achieved really nice performance. And again, for reinforcement learning, this is great. You're finally in the domain where we can learn something and we can say this is reasonable and we don't have to wait for a couple of days in the lab. And I could also show you a little bit that this is actually related to human performance. So this was we were also interested in basically trying to figure out whether humans can do reinforcement learning at all. We know that they can, but what can they really learn in motor control? So this was a little game where we basically had people, they had a pencil, a stylus on a tablet. They had a start point, they had to go to a line, they just saw a line. They had to pass to the line, but they didn't know where there was a hidden target, and they just got reward according to how close they are to the target. And then they can learn that, obviously, they basically, over a number of trials, they learn exactly where the target is. This is kind of the amount of reward as it increases over time. Okay, humans can do reinforcement learning, that's nice. But what's interesting about this, actually, the algorithm I just showed you could predict from trial to trial, on average, how people learn. I cannot explain this graph properly. This is just plotting different algorithms in terms of how they would change performance from trial to trial. And what is important is that this red line is this path integral reinforcement learning I showed you, and human performance was pretty well matched by this. So it turned out that what we've been doing happens to have a parallel seemingly in human reinforcement learning. Right, I need to make progress. Interaction with the environment. I showed you this diagram very briefly for our motor primitives. I didn't show you everything. There's one important component. Differential equations are a nice representation, but what is really nice about them is that you can add additional terms to them, which we call coupling terms. And these terms allow you to change behavior on the fly while you're doing things. You don't have to replan, you don't have to think, you don't have to compute, it happens automatically. All of you do this all the time. So the fun thing is, if you take a very tall person and a very short person, have them walk next to each other, you would expect that the short person actually runs or walks at a much higher frequency than the tall person with a lower frequency. Not at all. They synchronize. We have these synchronization effects all the time. When we catch a ball, we synchronize the approach of the ball to catch it at the right spot. There's always something where perception is directly coupled into behavior. And it's not that there's a wild optimizer running all the time and trying to figure out how to optimize things. There's some reflexive kind of coupling which comes into being. This is actually what makes these differential equations so interesting. Back to Peter Pastor. He actually did some experiments and some algorithms which mimic actually this kind of behavior. So now we have a cup, and the cup is put here on a green spot. Sorry that my movies are so low contrast here on this projector. And now he changed the green spot where the cup has to go, basically on the fly. And the robot simply reacts to that. This is the way these dynamical systems work. If you change the attractor point while this thing is moving, it will just still go there. The next component which he added is actually, here is a blue ball, hard to see. It's going to be an obstacle, and it's just going to go and perturb the robot. So the first is a normal movement where the cup is just put on the regular spot. And now the blue ball will be kind of trying to perturb the robot and annoy it a little bit. And it just naturally avoids it. Totally like very natural behavior. All of this happens just automatically out of these representations of these differential equations. No computing, no special computing is required, just a direct coupling of perception with the motor behavior. And if I had enough time, I could show you that there's human behavior that's beautifully modeled by that, which I'm going to skip right now. Almost done, so it will be roughly on time. Kind of better appropriate. Let me just add a little bit of fluid control. So the bigger block diagram of how to learn in motor systems is that there's some higher level decision-making process, movement planning, and then come these low-level control components. And what is there's a big difference about what people have been doing in industrial robotics for many years and what we're trying to do in this kind of new humanoid robots. One of the most important things is that we want humanoid robots to be safe and squishy. So I could now inspire you, take your neighbor, push the neighbor real hard. At least everybody will be awake afterwards. If you do this, everybody will softly give in. All of you are, if I may say so, squishy, which is nice. And there's an inherent part of the control system of your body. You give in. If you bump into someone on the Christian market, you give in. If you put an industrial robot there and you just plow through, everybody will be dead. That's obviously not what we want. You need to mimic these kind of things in robots. And it makes actually control much harder. This is kind of where we go into something which is compliant control, force control. You need to learn partially. This is a typical picture of modern machine learning. So this is not a neural network anymore. It's called graphical models now. It's a probabilistic reasoning machine, often with Bayes' theorem and other ideas. You can basically create a learning machinery which can nicely learn internal models of robots and then use them for control. And particularly use them for compliant control. And let me just show you, this is not a humanoid robot, it's not a cockroach, it's supposed to be a dog. And this is basically, the dog blindly goes over these terrains with what is called high gain control. It's very stiff. And as you can see, it fell over all the time. And now we went to a force controller with an internal model which would learn from data. And it now, again, it doesn't see any of those things. But it has way more robustness to go over those kind of terrains. Again, what it perceives was flat. What it really gets presented with is some kind of bizarre rough terrain with obstacles, some kind of imitated rocks and things like that. And with the help of this compliant control, which basically, there's something which is very natural. Every moment of time it tries to predict what is the force at every foot. If this is not matched by reality, it immediately kicks in a balancing repositioning so that the body stays balanced. So what you do when you walk, you suddenly hit a hole in the floor, you know before you step in the hole that something went wrong. This is prediction, predictive control. And fine, so this is now all stumbling across unperceived behaviors, but we can also make this now nicer after we have this behavior. We can now the system basically works with this compliant controllers and additional real planning. Now it perceives the terrain and it gets to much, much higher performance. So this is a project we worked on over 3 years, which was meant to basically try to push quadruped legged locomotion over rough terrain as much as possible. It was meant to be, the dog is about this big, it's about, whatever, 2.5 kilograms heavy, 40 centimeters long. It was a laboratory experiment, but really with the intention how far and what can you achieve in really complicated terrain. And this is all autonomous control, no joysticking or nothing. The system gets fairly good perception of the terrain actually from external cameras. But it has to learn how to get over these kind of rough terrains. It's actually, this is a snapshot of what we partially do with machine learning. The robot goes somewhere, we notice bad footholds, and we teach it with imitation learning what would be a good foothold, and then run machine learning algorithms to make the robot, so to speak, aware of these good footholds, and it increases performance tremendously. Well, if 4 liters are enough, you need to use the nose. So what's kind of less of this? The nose is very good. So this was just slipping, which happens automatically, and the robot recovers. So I'm essentially at my end here. So this was kind of a snapshot of projects which we tried to do. Starting from representation and basically working our way up through all the modules to create more and more autonomous to complete system behavior. Just let me add one component here. What really matters in these systems is kind of learning what people call perception action. So there's a system, there's perception, sensor processing, action generating, and there are these loops. Machine learning in general has not addressed an awful lot of those components so far. Machine learning lives in a different world. They give someone a bag of data, and they analyze it, and they give you a result. Robotics control is very different. You create the data yourself. You always work out of a loop. Basically, understanding how to learn and how to basically have autonomy in these perception action loops, I think is a very exciting topic. And if you go one step further, if you want to go to general autonomous systems, so this is a little bit of a sketch of interesting research topics for the future. I say to humanoid robotics as the beginning of understanding autonomous systems on a larger scale, on a systems level. And that hopefully branches out over time into many other domains, like micro and nano robots, a very fascinating topic, but mostly on the material science side so far, not so much on the control side. At some point, we would like to most likely understand how to control cells, to manipulate them. Self-assembly, how can systems self-repair or create themselves. Interfaces between biological and technological systems is a very exciting topic. Lots of topics which really get inspired by, I think, the beginning of understanding of autonomous systems in humanoid robotics, and which will branch out into a bigger understanding of autonomous systems in general. Thank you very much.